everyone who is in the room. It is my pleasure really tonight to introduce this live event for the session, The Poetics of Abya Yala, Towards a Non-Colonial History of Contemporary Art. The specially invited chair of the session is Pablo Jose Ramirez, who is a curator, art writer, and cultural theorist, currently the adjunct curator of First Nations and Indigenous art at Tate Modern. And it is thanks to Pablo's vision that we were able to put together this panel this evening. As you may know, or may not know, each speaker today has contributed a pre-recorded presentation to the conference, which can be viewed freely on the conference website in the page dedicated to this session. And I urge you to go and visit it and watch the contributions. And the speakers I am delighted to introduce today are, in order of appearance, Cristian Vargas Payaqueque. Sorry for my pronunciation. So he is a Mapuche art historian, academic, and researcher who offers in his paper an enlightening view of Indigenous contemporary art, decolonial discourse, and a critique of multiculturalism since Wayamapu. And in this paper, he offers really an incredible roadmap to understanding the complexities of Indigenous contemporary art and the decolonization of representation. Then we are honored to have artist and illustrator from the Sarawak community, Venuka Evnan, who discusses her practice, offering an insight into how a traditional painting technique has been engaging with the contemporary art circuit and its institutions, while maintaining fundamental ties to the Sarawak community and its struggles for representation. Lena Goyer is research assistant at TU Dresden. And in her paper, she explores the painting practice of Mogahe Gihu, commonly known as Abel Rodriguez, through the notion of an aesthetics of renunciation. Meanwhile, she is tracing how the artist has gained visibility within Western institutions. Then we have the wonderful, Bernardo Oyersun, who explores marginality in history and society. And he presents this to us through his sculpture Tentativa, which represents a monumentalized version of a golden guanaco found in an Inca tomb on Plomo Hill, just above Santiago de Chile, and which he attempts to position as a public monument challenging colonial origin stories of Chile. Finally, we have Brenda Vega, who explores a pre-Inca conception of time and its relation with celestial bodies through her long exposure photographic practice devoted to the preservation of memory in some of the sacred places of Ecuador. And of course, with no further ado, I am honored to introduce our keynote speaker tonight, Boaventura de Sousa Santos. He is Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Coimbra in Portugal and Distinguished Legal Scholar at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has published numerous essential books, too many to mention, and many of which are, of course, on our bookshelves, on issues such as globalization, sociology of law and the state, epistemology, social movements, and the World Social Forum. His most recent project, Alice, Leading Europe to a New Way of Sharing the World Experiences, is funded by the prestigious Advanced Grant of European Research Council. So following Boaventura's keynote address, we will begin the roundtable discussion chaired by Pablo Jose Ramirez with all contributors to the session. Please add your question at any point in the chat or Q&A boxes, and there will be time during or after the discussion to address them. Please note that this event is being recorded. And finally, I have the honor to welcome Professor de Sousa Santos and leave to you the stage. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Hello, thank you very much for the invitation. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here, particularly because this is a topic very dear to me. In the proposal that I've been putting forward of the epistemology of the South, and the art and the aesthetics plays a very major role. And it so happens that probably is not known to you, but it has facilitated the fact that I'm also a poet with 11 books of poetry published in Portuguese and Spanish. And therefore, I think the transit of narratives, it has been, in a sense, easier to me. But in fact, what I'm going to try to have in this half an hour that I have is to present some ideas of the reason why I think the art and the aesthetics and the poetry and literature and theater and music and dance are particularly relevant from a point of view of the epistemology of the South. And I distribute to Sophia, she may probably put that available to you, a manifesto on art and the epistemology of the South that I present at the Biennale of Art de La Habana in Cuba, 2019. It is my first attempt in a very simple way to try to present some of the ideas of the epistemology of the South. But very briefly, probably some of you have had contact with my most recent work, the End of the Cognitive Empire, where I have laid out the foundations of the epistemology of the South. The epistemology of the South are very ancient. Of course, we know all that. The naming is something new, but the real thing has always been there for a long time. And I propose that we have been having, particularly in our universities around the world, two main paradigms of knowledge concerning the idea of the relationship between knowledge and the struggle, the social struggles. Usually epistemologists deal with knowledge separated from the struggle, from social struggle. And the two paradigms have been the dominant one, of course, is the Hegel paradigm, according to which knowledge comes after the struggle. The howl of Minerva, as Hegel says, flies at dusk. After the social struggles, there is calm enough, things are calm, and we can start reflection and doing our knowledge. What is the problem with this paradigm? Is that after the end of the struggle, only the knowledge of the winners persists. And in fact, the knowledge of the losers of history is gone because they have been vanquished, or at least is not recognized as being there. And that's why probably at universities, you have been teaching mostly the knowledge of the winners of history, not the knowledge of the losers. And that's why we need to undergo a profound decolonization of the university. The second paradigm is almost the opposite, is the Marxist paradigm, is knowledge before the struggle. Because Marx understood that, in fact, the working class was not a revolutionary class in itself. It had to be taught through a new science, Marxist science, that would allow her to have a class consciousness, a revolutionary class consciousness, and therefore is a knowledge before the struggle. Well, this is very, very important in my training. I consider myself a kind of a Marxist that is trying to decolonizing himself. But in fact, there is also lots of frustration with this paradigm. So I'm proposing a third paradigm, which is knowledge is born in struggle, neither after nor before, but during the struggles, born in struggles. Because I think my experience with social movements, indigenous movements, Afro-descendant, women, peasants, and so on, both in Africa and Latin America, have told me that, in fact, from their perspective, from the perspective of the struggles, it is easier probably. There is lots of renewal of epistemology that are possible. So knowledge of the South has always been there, but not recognized by our universities, is the knowledge produced by those that have been resisting against modern Western-centric domination, and those that have suffered most with that domination. And the domination for them is very clearly a domination with three major dimensions: capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. There are others, caste system, political religion, others, but these that are the main dominations. So from their point of view, it's very clear that colonialism is not something of the past. It's here with us. What ended was historical colonialism done by, foreign occupation, but the colonialism resisted and continued under a different form. Internal colonialism, racism, land grabbing, expulsion of peasants and indigenous people from their territory, energetic colonialism, you name it. Colonialism goes on, it's very well in the life under very different forms. When we look at that from that perspective, we can see that our societies, modern societies, are really crossed through what I call an abyssal line. And this abyssal line is the abyssal line that separates two forms of sociability: the sociability of the fully human beings and the sociability of those that are never considered fully human. They are considered subhuman. And in fact, this idea of subhumanity is very important to contradict the liberal tradition of universality, of equality, because in fact, it is not possible in a social political regime shot through with capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. There will always be subhumanity together with humanity. And what counts of subhumanity? Those bodies that have been dominated and have been resisting against colonialism and patriarchy. It is colonialism and patriarchy that produces racialized and sexualized bodies that produced highly devalued labor and non-paid labor that is absolutely central to reproduction of capitalism. So this idea of the abyssal line is very important in my own thinking. And I don't go into that because I don't have much time to that, to see what is the importance of that from an epistemological point of view. And the first thing is of course, that societies, modern societies, both North and South, even though in different ways, they are divided by this radical and radically invisible abyssal line between the fully human and the subhuman. If we take in Europe the 20,000 immigrants that drowned in the Mediterranean in recent years, well, imagine that these people were citizens of the United States, of Germany, of the UK. That would be a major crisis, but in fact, nothing happened. There was no crisis. And why not? Because they were really considered by the dominant knowledge and politics in Europe as subhuman. They are immigrants from Bangladesh, from Middle East, and from Africa. And the same is happening now on the borders between Belarus and Poland. I mean, these people are considered subhuman. So this ontological degradation that goes together with an epistemological degradation, because degraded bodies as racialized and sexualized cannot produce relevant knowledge. And that's why a massive epistemicide is created, a massive sociology of absences, people that are thought as non-existent and produced as non-existent. And therefore, whatever they do, whatever they think, whatever the culture they have, is not made relevant in our universities and in our public opinion. So it's very important, this radical analysis of the sociology of absences, so that then you can, once you do that, to know what I call and to engage with the sociology of emergencies. That is to say, how much rich experience, epistemological, cultural, political experience goes on in the world. A few hours ago, I was with the president of the Constitutional Assembly, an indigenous leader, Mapuche in Chile, and we were discussing precisely the abyssal line, because the Mapuche people, they have their own laws, the very ancient laws, but they are not recognized by the Chilean state. And now we are discussing the ways in which the Mapuche law can be considered law under the new constitution. At least that's the struggle of the people with whom I'm in solidarity, and try to rewrite or write a new constitution that is more intercultural, plurinational, popular, and feminist. So let's to take this into account, then this is the panorama very briefly. Now, what is the impact of this on art? I have come to the conclusion that the artists, and I'm going to tell you, even though I already acknowledge that I am a poet, in fact, I've been working with rappers, basically, and with slam poets, and also with curators in museums, both in the UK, in Glasgow, for instance, in Bristol, and in Sweden, and in Latin America, also a lot in Berlin. Museum curators, young curators that are trying to refound the idea of museum and the idea of the archive, and therefore producing an insurgent archive. And I have noticed that, in fact, the abyssal line is so difficult to speak about the abyssal line. If I am at university now with mainstream people, it is so easy when you look at the lyrics of the rappers, for instance, or the many poets and artists of different kinds. They have been so clear in defining that our societies are divided by this abyssal line of racialized and sexualized bodies, and therefore producing ontological degradation. So their lyrics is basically about racism and the abyssal line. And by doing this, they have been putting forward new narratives, narratives of lyrics, of poetry, of aesthetics, that in fact bring what I call the liberated zones of the arts and of the aesthetic, because they confront the received canon of aesthetics, the Adornian and so on, you know that as well as I do, and they really try to subvert it, to bring other kinds of art, other kinds of aesthetics. And that's with them that I've been trying to see why the artists in general, it is so easy for them to see the abyssal line, to walk on the abyssal line, very often to see the two sides of sociability, the metropolitan sociability of the fully human beings and the colonial sociability of the subhuman beings. Many of them have been raised up in the colonial zone, others in the metropolitan zone. But when they become post-abyssal, when they look at the abyssal line, then they really denounce it with a radicality that I don't see in our philosophical, sociological, or other texts. And that's why I've worked with them, collaborated with them, and I even wrote lyrics in rap, and they are available in Portuguese. You can read a small book called Rap Global, in which, in fact, I felt that as a sociologist, I could not express all my indignation, rage by this unjust, radical unjust society. And therefore, I think that the epistemology of the South, that is to say, if you focus on the knowledge born in struggle, you can bring all these knowledges that are not credited as real knowledges in our universities, but in fact have been so creative and have been so wonderful to try to reveal the abyssal exclusions, as I call them, those that have been ontologically degraded, even though they themselves are full human. They are dignified people in undignified conditions, basically. So I think it's this antinomy that took me into the arts. And in fact, I could tell you lots of things, but on this, but probably there will be debate on this. What I would like to tell you is that, for instance, the summaries of my classes, the PhD classes here at University of Coimbra, the summaries are done by artists, because I have come to the conclusion that I have among my students, all of them, in a sense, our students. Very often they are artists. They are poets, rappers, painters, performers, theater players, you name it, musicians. But we at the university don't allow them to express their creativity. So I decided that together with them, that the summary of my classes could be done in rap, for instance, or in slam poetry. And we did that. The book is available in Portuguese and in Spanish, not in English as yet. And the first show that video that I'd like to share with you is, and I asked Sophia to do that, is a video of a student of mine, a doctoral student. In fact, he got his PhD in geography in Brazil, but he was doing a doctoral stay with me in Coimbra. And he's a rapper. He's a very well-known rapper in Brazil. He's called Renan Inquérito. So I asked them to express the idea of my abyssaline, that is to say, an epistemological concept and a sociological concept, put it in rap. And you can see that when the artists do this, it is a different narrative. It is not the same thing, but they are expressing the same reality. And this is what I call the ecologies of knowledges. That is to say, I'm as a sociologist or an epistemologist, I can bring together with the artists and we join the struggle on a concept. So listen to the Abyssaline by Renan Inquérito. And if you know what I've been writing about the Abyssaline, particularly in the epistemology of the South or the end of the cognitive empire, you can see how they are related. But then it's a 2-minute video, so please, Sophia.
É a linha que vai da bandeira, as sociedades metropolitanas, e cujo conceito fundamental é o conceito de dinâmica. Os cristãos escolhidos do outro lado da linha são aqueles cuja realidade é realidade. Tem tanta linha que a gente inventou. Tem linha de montagem, até linha retrô, linha de pensamento, linha do Equador, linha de telefone e linha de tricô, linhas reais ou imaginárias, linhas inúteis são necessárias, só sigo aquilo que o poeta falou, quem anda na linha é trem ou metrô, sou água que corre entre as pedras, passageiro, liberdade ninguém carrega, pode ver, tô na linha de tiro e não posso moscar, na linha por um fio não dá pra vacilar. Então sigamos a utopia lagaliana. Continuo andando, vivendo e sonhando. A esperança me move, ela que é minha fonte. Eu só sigo uma linha, a linha do horizonte. Vemos separados no mesmo quintal. A dimensão é tão profunda, é tão desigual. Não posso aceitar que seja normal. Separa o disparo certeiro do acidental. Um mundo metropolitano e outro colonial. Que põe direitos humanos pra secar no varal. E faz o navio negreiro parecer tão atual. A linha não é tênue, sei que não tá vendo. É só lembrar, vai de power, public enemy. Na vertical é barra, é prisão. Na horizontal é letra, é libertação. A linha corta, entorta e é porta também. Engorda, vira corda e enforca também. Enquanto a fome e a miséria tiver online, o rap sempre vai ser uma punchline. Vemos separados no mesmo quintal. A dimensão é tão profunda, é tão desigual.
Okay. What happened?
Oh, did you want the whole thing? Sorry, that was 2 minutes.
Okay, good. So I'm glad. So that's, as you can see, probably some of you could follow it. It's in Portuguese, and it is really an attempt to convey all the idea of the abyssal exclusion involving ontological degradation out of the abyssaline. But in fact, the epistemology of the South, probably against some of the colonial thinking, is not just about the critique, it's about also the alternative. What I've been mentioning as an alternative thinking of alternatives. And these alternatives is that whenever you do this critique of the abyssaline, then all the diversity, epistemological diversity of the world emerges, and we have ecological knowledges, the ecology of knowledges, some ancient and some modern. If you work with indigenous people, you can see how they integrate new cultures and elements in the ancestral culture, or the peasants or the African peasants, the same in different ways, of course, and according to their own criteria and rules. So the idea of ecology of knowledge is it's very important for the epistemology of the South, and we need, of course, intercultural translation. So I'm going to show just another short video. Is by an orchestra, a very excellent orchestra in Buenos Aires, in Argentina, in which through a great musician put together all the indigenous instruments, very old instruments, then combined with high technology of music, and you can see how they have done that in Cusco. I have been with them in several occasions. Look at this very short video of this orchestra as combining the ancient and the high technology in an ecology of knowledges. Okay, so that was a brief video that of the orchestra. Just you can have, if you go to the web pages or to the websites, you can see lots of the videos from them. So these are the ones with whom I've been working. But in any case, I like at the end of my presentation to show a third case. Is that the idea that the art, and I know that there are curators and artists among you, so they know that much better than I do. That usually in struggles today, the struggles, social struggles, particularly Latin America, are very colorful. I've been comparing some of the protests by high class, reactionary, sometimes extreme right, and they are black and white. I mean, they are really nothing. They have no color. But once you have the social movements protesting and on the streets, it's very colorful. And they do produce art in the worst possible conditions to try to give creativity and beauty to their struggle. I've been working, and we are producing a book out of the collaboration with the people that are in the front line of the struggle in Cali. We are Cali, Colombia. You know that in April there was an estallido social, a social explosion, and out of that there were lots of people. In fact, yesterday they assassinated another leader, a young leader from one of the Puerto Resistencia. They have been assassinating them. 72 now with him have been assassinated, but they have been producing very excellent art, but art that challenges the canon, because basically all the art born in struggle is really, they create monuments that are anti-monuments. They are not monuments with authorship. They are collective monuments. So I ask Sophia to show a photo of the monument, a very 10 minutes high monument that has been put there, La Mano Resista, the hand resisting, or the resisting hand. This is a beautiful monument that is still there. It has been really attacked by the rightist forces and by the government that has been trying to put it down. It has to be defended by the people. This is a monument that is an anti-monument, because you cannot see from here, but in fact, it is a product of the collaboration of men and women that have been in the struggle. Each community has brought something to organize this monument, and they were producing it for days and days. And it was a big celebration. It is there, a symbol of the aesthetics of the revolution that is going on in Cali. In fact, it's tragic because of the how much suffering they have to undergo to do this. And this is very interesting because it brings together the indigenous struggle and the urban youth, unemployed, without any horizon, people that usually come from very long periods of violence in Colombia. They are their children from the wars, from the counter insurgency wars and things like that. And so it is really, again, a product of art that has been there. And this, in a sense, creates a radical critique of this society, but does that with beauty. But it renews beauty by changing the canon of what we consider to be beauty. What we a work of art doesn't have the aura that is very important for Adorno's aesthetic theory, but it is this. So I think that we are, if we look at this, we can see how we can renew the arts and aesthetics and how this is relevant for our universities, for our knowledges. And I think, in my view, it's really part of the epistemology of the South. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Boaventura. This was quite enriching. Thank you for your generosity and all these ideas around art, the public kind of nature of art, and all this articulation through the notion of epistemologies of the South. I have many questions, but I'll try to put them together in my kind of schizophrenic notes. One is that you were mentioning in also the document that you made reference to, that you presented for the Havana Biennale, the idea that for the epistemologies of the South, there is no one single general aesthetics, right? And I remember this curator, this Cuban curator, a good friend, once she told me, you can go to the Louvre and see a Picasso, and you are allowed to not feel anything. You don't have to like it. So like there is no general universal taste, as there are no universal aesthetics. But my question goes in terms of what we have come to know as contemporary art. So as some have put it, like Boris Groy, some art historians, contemporary art somehow begins, or it's one of its kind of temporalizations could be the neoliberal moment, right? Like after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So one of the paradoxes that personally I've been working with is that the notion of contemporary art works within the paradox of being decentralized and needing of like of a sort of diversity of cultural enunciations in order to exist. So we, for instance, in the 90s, see how museum collections were radically decentralized. Like there was this eagerness for like acquiring African artworks, Latin American, and so on. On the other hand, the boom of the biennales in the 90s as well. So when art sees paradox between aiming at decentralization, liberalization as the universal canon, which kind of like takes me back to your point. So I was wondering, how is that you see that, and how is that you see that in terms of art production and perhaps neoliberalism and art institutions?
Pablo, could you repeat the last part? Because I think that your internet or my internet was big. So it was very interrupted when you said just the final part, very final part.
Of course. In this case, Latin America, And oh, sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, otherwise I'll change my connection. How is that you see this happening in terms of Latin American contemporary indigenous art, or let's say Latin American art, and its relationship to art infrastructures and neoliberalism? How is that you see this paradox between being universal in terms of politics, but discursively aiming all the time as a decentralization and inclusivity?
Okay, good. Can you put three questions together? Usually in my debates, I put three questions together and then I answer. If
Definitely, definitely. That's much better. Thank you. The other thing that I was quite attracted to was the idea that you mentioned of like a sort of decentralized kind of decenter regime of aesthetics, where the visual regime is not the only one. As we know, Western cultures are mostly oculocentric. So for instance, sound, rituality, performance, dance, poetry, etc., are sometimes left aside. And with examples that you gave us with these wonderful films, I was thinking on also on your view of that. To think on, let's say, non-Western aesthetics would be necessarily to think in let's say, crisol of practices that are not necessarily visually centered. So I was wondering also about your view on that. And last question, I would like to know a little bit more about this. How is that you see the notion of indigenous art as such? In Western museums, in Europe and in the United States, there has been, on the last 5 years, a very strong increase and openness in terms of indigenous art. Like museum boards have been, for instance, pushing to acquire more indigenous art collections, new acquisition committees are being formed, and so on. So let's say this is the moment, as some would say, of indigenous art, where like finally they, like, indigenous artists have a seat at the table, as Ian McLean puts it, this Australian art historian. So I was thinking, Bonaventura, like, how is that you see indigenous art and its relationship to what you mentioned in terms of the production of racialized bodies? Because the very notion of indigenous as such is a colonial concept. So how is it we engage with a colonial concept and use that probably as a tool that can be actually, let's say, emancipatory? So that would be the last one. Thank you so much.
Okay, Pablo, this is wonderful. I was saying that usually have three questions by three different people, but you have three questions by the same person. It's excellent, because they are very good questions. Look, Pablo, from my point of view, there is no single general theory, cannot be anyone. Why? Because in fact, whenever you try to create a general theory, in fact, you are cannibalizing part of reality. Because that's why I always mention the epistemology of the South. I also mention, and I work on the aesthetics of the South, in the plural. There is no unified structure. We can't struggle for a mutual understanding and mutual enrichment of very different proposals of art from bottom up in India, in Africa, in Latin America, in Europe, to create a kind of a subaltern cosmopolitan aesthetics. But it's not dictated from top down, a kind of a general abstract type of universalism. So we have to struggle for these understandings. And in fact, the biennales, the museums may be points of entry for a cosmopolitan, but they also can be an entry for taming insurgency, for destroying the radical nature of arts and aesthetics. Otherwise, we know very well the voracity of the epistemologies of the North, as I call them, to integrate, assimilate, accommodate the difference in order to destroy it. And I think that your third question goes very much to that. I mean, of course, in any generation, we have to start our conversation using the concepts that are there, because the struggles, usually the terms of the struggles, are defined by the people that have more power in a given struggle. And the struggle consists in changing the rules of the game, the terms of the struggle. So I have to start with the idea of indigenous, because in fact, as you said, is originally, and that's why sometimes we talk about the originary people, pueblos originarios, etc. But in fact, the question is always there to try to change it by the ways in which you recognize them. What is a kind of an attitude that will be more akin to the idea of the epistemology of the South with this, with indigenous art, is that the absorption of this insurgency that is expressed by, suppose that a billionaire from Texas buy the mano resiste and put the mano resiste in his gardens. I mean, it is possible today. This one is not possible because they are not going to sell it. It is there and defended by the people in Cali because there is a struggle around the monument. But in fact, could be destroyed in that way. Many of our artistic insurgency, starting with Picasso and so on, it was put in the same way. So what is the difference? At least with the museum curators that I've been working with, is to show that from the epistemology of the South, for instance, Vecchia is now in Sweden, we have been working with the concept that in fact, if you look at the aesthetics from the perspective of the epistemology of the South, you cannot separate that aesthetics from the struggles going on the ground. So how can you really integrate the two if in fact the artistic object is bought by the museum and is exhibited in the museum? This is precisely what we have to do, and that's what the curators have to do. Why? Because most of the museums are funded by the same companies that are destroying the indigenous people through the extraction of minerals and all the natural resources existing in their territories. So they are the donors, and we accept those donors in order to put indigenous art here. I see that as a contradiction. You have to denounce them. I think there is no better way of exhibiting without taming, without destroying the radical insurgency potential of this art, without showing the relations of production, I would say. How is this indigenous art extracted in a fetishistic way from the struggles in which they have been created and exhibited on the metropolitan sociability? So they are taken away from the colonial sociability into the metropolitan sociability in an extractive way. I mean, extraction is not just natural resources. For many years as a sociologist, I also was an extractivist, because once you conduct interviews with people, what are you doing? In fact, usually if you are in our departments, and I have, supervise hundreds of doctoral students, we tell them very often, I mean, the people don't have knowledge, they have information. We even have a concept of the privileged informant. And we go with our questionnaire or the script for the checklist of the participant observation. We don't care about their knowledge. We think that knowledge is ours. We produce knowledge, they produce information. This is extractivism. So we have to really, that's why, and this the end of the cognitive empire is divided in three parts. The first one is epistemological, the second is methodological, because we cannot go on with methodologies that are extractive. They have to be collaborative, they have to be participative. And in order to be participative or participatory, we can transcend that, you can take that through the arts and the aesthetics, and you have to denounce in the process and of the museum that this is a product of extraction, but is a product of the resistance against extraction. So it involves a sense of denunciation. So the idea is not very difficult to see all this art, how it is reconstructed. I don't know if you know that beautiful project, I think it was originally in the Netherlands, on the former West, because after the fall of the Berlin Wall, I collaborated with that project. It's a fabulous project to see all of a sudden why the West is the norm and all the artists in the former Soviet bloc were marginals, were peripheries, were ignored, and so on. And that's why the project is called the former West. That is to say, you are still the other side of the line. The wall was, in fact, an abyssal line in political terms and in cultural terms. So I think that it is not easy because we are in a period of rampant neoliberalism. The same people, for instance, the ones that I've been more in contact with, besides now the Cali people or the indigenous people in Brazil, are the people in Mexico, in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, which is now going through a period, it's a period near Oaxaca, in which we have really very creative artists there. But it is a dramatic situation of what we call energetic colonialism, because the Spanish firms that are doing the energy transition in Europe with renewable energy, how do they do that? By implanting thousands of eolic mills, of eolic generators in the mountains of the mountains, and they have destroyed the lives of the people, because everybody knows that if you are 100 meters away from that mill, the sound is terrible. You cannot sleep with that. But imagine thousands of those. We call this energetic colonialism. Artists are showing the abyssal line, and they are refusing, in fact, to be appropriated by the collections. And I think that's the major challenge in the United States, Canada, and Europe, is that they don't want to be appropriated. They want to present in their own terms. For instance, next week, that in 2 weeks' time, we'll be welcoming here in Coimbra a mission of the Zapatistas. I don't know if you know that the Zapatistas have been traveling in Europe, and they are coming to Coimbra, to my center. And we are going to show a film and then have a discussion on them. They are precisely the ones that are creating, I would say, a new form of the former West, as the former West in a different way. I mean, Europe as a kind of a barbarism, because what we call civilization, from their point of view, and for very good reasons, for 4 centuries, is a form of barbarism. So I think this is the radical line of the abyssal lines. And as you know, probably, if you know my work, you can see that in sociology of absences, I distinguish 3 kinds of emergences. The counter-hegemonic appropriations, which the artists very often do, enter the museum as a counter-hegemonic appropriation. They create liberated zones. That's another form of emergence. And they have the ruin seeds, that is to say, their own language for their own work in their own communities. They are ruins and seeds. And when they are liberated zones, is the Mano Resiste in Cali, it is a liberated zone. That square now is a liberated zone through this monument, this anti-monument monument. So I think it is possible and it is being done, but it is very difficult with the hegemony of not only of neoliberalism. Of course, neoliberalism is there, you know, and even if you are a Banksy, you know how difficult it is to fight capitalism. It's our canon, artistic canon, because usually I see the fights of young curators with whom I've been working, how much they have to fight with the directors of the museums, because if they see, for instance, if we come with a debate on these questions that I just told you, the donors, and I have done that in Spain, well, the directors don't like that because could endanger the donors and things like that. So that's part of the struggle, Pablo. We have to go on this. So I'll be glad if there are more questions. I'll be glad.
Thank you so much, Boaventura. Yeah, so what we can do now is, so we have here in the panel also a wonderful group of people, Bernardo Yarzún, Benuka Ebanan, también tenemos a, oh, sorry, I just jumped to Spanish, Lena Gewer, Brenda Vega, and Christian Vargas. So as many of the people that is today tuning in, the presentations of each one of them were uploaded to the website. So the idea now, it would be to kind of like chat about some of the issues Boaventura raised. And I think that also there might be some questions and comments from the panelists to Boaventura. So I'll leave it open for now in case there is. Otherwise, I'll follow up with some direct also comments to each one of you.
I have a question.
In case someone wants to jump in.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to speak in English right now because now I got used to, first of all, I want to speak in Spanish. So thank you so much for your talk, Mr. Nesusa Santos here, I know. So I wish I could have joined this discussion maybe 5 years earlier, or maybe 6, when I started on my PhD about the arte argentino, because then some things would be much clearer, I guess. But now I just try to organize my thoughts. I start to think about arte argentino in Buenos Aires, and the first museum I went to was the Museo Ambrosetti Etnográfico in Buenos Aires. And there, the first question I made is, where is the indigenous art inside of arte argentino? And I have to be honest, there was no direct answer. I had to do a long research, and when I wanted to try to explain what means arte argentino, or when I wanted to do the research, and it became much more difficult when I went to see the biography of the artists, of Luis Felipe Noé, for example, or Marta Minujín. In the 60s, they went to Paris, to live in Paris, to New York, and Noé was the one who said, okay, I can't do this kind of art, I need to do another one, an Argentinian one. And Marta Minujín totally adapted to the art world, and she was with Dali and with Andy Warhol, as we all know, maybe. So, but I realized that the history of art is really entangled, and there is a network, and we try to explain that through transcultural perspectives. That was, yeah, maybe the approach that I took then to describe what they are doing, but still there were difficulties. And now that I just read your paper towards an aesthetic of the epistemologies of the South, I kind of felt a little bit I felt reminded to Garcia Canclini, because he's also a sociologist, and then I just asked myself, I have friends here in Europe, I'm from Europe, and I have friends in Argentina, and I met artists, wonderful artists that, for example, Cristian Vargas represented, Sebastián and Paula in Chile. I met them last year in Cologne because they were invited. So you are pointing on the post-abyssal artists, on the practice of art. But I was just wondering, isn't it the nation that we have to focus and to criticize? And how can I understand the points, the critique, but how can we really take this into our practice, into our everyday practice? And what about the nation? I mean, we are all working under this big topic, and you also mentioned the 3 problems that we have, I mean, all over the world, the patriarchy, capitalism, and colonialism. But I missed a little bit the center of the nation here, and yeah, maybe you can just say some words about it. And just to add, I felt that my topic that I try to present here, my new research here on the renunciation, and I try to show that in the work of Mogaji Liu. You totally named it when you said we have to show the processes when we do exhibitions. No, that's maybe the point, and maybe that's the summary of my ponencia. Bueno, muchas gracias. Voy a dejarlo aquí.
Pablo, I don't know if you want that I answer to Lena or more conversation. I mean, I like. I
would say, like, if there's someone that wants to also launch a provocation or a question or a comment among the panelists, because we are receiving Q&A that from the audience that we would do at the end. So if someone else from the panelists here wants to jump in, you're very much welcome. Otherwise, I think that I can also connect this to some of the papers that are already, by the way, online on the website. But I was thinking, following Boaventura's presentation and Lena, your last comment, in Bernardo and Benuca's practice, artistic practice, in your case, Bernardo, you in the presentation you gave, you articulated ideas around coloniality and the kind of fabrication of colonial history through this work of yours, Tentativa, which was consisted on the replacement of a statue of the colonizer Pedro de Valdivia in the Plaza de Armas de Santiago de Chile. And the idea was to propose a real golden guanaca, right? So you articulate in a quite powerful way ideas of like the public space, the pre-Columbian aesthetics, and that kind of assembled in your work. And I was, and then kind of jumping, trying to articulate with more than one person, thinking on Benucas. So Benuca, as we have spoken in the past, your practice, I've been always quite enchanted, let's say, and amazed by how is that you deal between the community of Sarua and what is a long-standing practice with the tablas de Sarua as a register of visual memory of the community and so on, but also with the art institutions and the museums and so on. So I think that if one of you or the two would like also to jump in with this, I'm wondering how is that you transit, how is that you bridge different contexts, working with the community, working with art infrastructures, the museum, how you negotiate this. In your case, Benuca, I know that also you posit issues around gender and sexuality at the center of your work. And that in a way also is a disruption of the tradition. So you are a continuation of the tradition and a disruption at the same time. So just opening some questions in case some of you want to comment. Okay, so no comments. I'll follow up then.
Perdón. Ahora sí puedo hablar.
Oh, sorry, my mic was off. Sorry, I couldn't open my mic. So first of all, Pablo, thank you for the invitation. It was very interesting to hear what was said before. And as you were saying, you know, from my perspective, I have this technique that comes from a community, which is Sarua, but at the same time, I apply that to show my concerns as a woman, as a child of immigrants, of Chanos. So what I try to do is I mix all of those elements from my community with different ideas. And as you were saying, we're trying to reach different spaces as well. Not just the artisans per se, but we're trying to also break those barriers and go beyond and be just like any type of artist that went to school and studied art. We want to be the same type of artist as well. We want to show our art. So we want to include the voice of women. We want to show that in paintings, in my case. And for me, you know, to see all this discussion, to meet you, to see indigenous art in different countries is very interesting, a great experience. So I'm so happy to be here, and I will continue to work with this. So now I'm still working on paintings. I am in a contest right now, and it is very important to me because I can generate interest in people, so they will reach out to the community and try to find out more about the community, about the peoples. I mean, it's people who never went to school to study art, but they still have a lot of experiences that came from their family members, from their lives. So that's how we work. Just wanted to say hello to everyone. Thank you.
Bernardo, could I
Thank
just
you, Venuka.
ask you to comment on the idea of pre-Columbian aesthetics and how is that you bring that to your work, for instance, in the example that you presented in your paper? I don't know, can you hear us, Bernardo? I think that maybe, yeah. Everyone else can hear me, right? Okay, so maybe it's just Bernardo. Yeah, we'll try to let him know because I think that he's not listening.
Yeah.
Okay.
Pablo.
Yes.
Yo no hablo inglés, me puedes preguntar en
I don't speak English. Can you please ask me in Spanish?
No, me preguntaba por el tema de la
I was asking about the idea of pre-Columbian aesthetics and how that is translated in your practice with the whole idea of the public monument, like the case that you presented in your presentation. Can you just quickly tell us a little bit about that? Yes, of course. In several pieces that we've developed and that have been inspired by indigenous art, there's a very strong motivation that has to do with looking for those canons that are in popular art and in craftsmanship and in popular art, especially, and in indigenous art. This is a very complex topic. When we look into the indigenous world, something that I found beautiful is that the word art does not exist in Mapuche, for example, in the Mapuche world. Art is considered not something specific, but something that's integrated and a part of everything. Therefore, looking for a canon or something more structured or academic is very complex. So it's a paradox, actually, because we start looking for those parameters, we start looking for those canons from a Western perspective, because I did go to art school, for example, and I start filtering and looking for those canons, but with the tools that I learned in college and university. So it's a very complex topic. It's an extremely complex topic. Of course, the Guanaco copy, of course, I had the piece there. I could replicate it, and I was inspired by a political act. My inspiration was the intent to get rid of the conquistador monument that was right there in the Arms Square. But in other instances, it's more complex. For example, where using traditional, like Mapuche masks, for example, and include them into contemporary art, that exercise is much more complex. The tool that I used was a material counterpart. So basically that has been the search. I think that in this search we have a lot of mix, or let's say a type of contamination, quote unquote contamination, because we do have like this type of Western perspective and way of thinking. At least that's what happens to me. Thank you so much, Bernardo.
¿Puedo hacer un pequeño apunto? Que Bernardo,
sí,
se
sí.
puede activar la
I would just like to tell you that you can activate simultaneous interpretation in the bottom part of your Zoom screen. There is a globe and you can click on it and choose Spanish or English. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sophia. I'm gonna open a little bit also for some questions of the audience that are coming in, and please feel free to jump in, any of the panelists and Boaventura, of course. So We have someone is asking if the question says, if today we're facing a new momentum for indigenous art, but at the same time institutions are doing extractivism over art, what could be a fair way to show indigenous art without trying to take advantage of the momentum? And I think that I'm going to push a little bit more here. And I would like, because it was something that I was thinking with your presentation, Christian, like how, because you articulate this critique of neoliberal multiculturalism, right? And think on coloniality as a sort of continuous temporality, right? So in your way, indigenous artists still living under colonial oppression, right? As it is. So for the case of Chile and Mapuche artists, what is your view on this, perhaps relating to the previous question?
Bueno, ¿me oyen bien? ¿Sí?
Can you hear me? Yes.
Con la invitación.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you for the invitation and hello to everyone. It is very complex because I think that we have to analyze continuous processes. First of all, the continuous process has to do with what access the indigenous world has had to these spaces that are usually capitalized and are led by the elite. Why do I say this? Because a large part or a generation of indigenous artists, in the case of the Mapuche artists in the 90s, many of them they started to do art without belonging to schools or art schools or institutionalized art institutions. So most of the indigenous Mapuche artists that I know, we belong to the first generation that studies in universities formally, the first ones in our families. So I think that that's something very important to take into consideration because, I mean, it isn't a coincidence that we have less access to education as indigenous people. Another important aspect has to do with how these practices, these indigenous practices, are perceived and received. And this has to do with the notion of indigenous art. And I also wanted to talk about this because when we think about indigenous art, when we go to a museum, for example, we notice that indigenous art is always thinking, I mean, they always show it or convey it as the past, traditional rituals or traditional practices. And that's something that we do. I mean, we like see this indigenous art and we see Mesoamerica, like as if there were no cultural differences between indigenous people. And that shows us what the hegemonic view is about these people. So what happens? And this is what I say in my research. In contemporary indigenous art, there is this idea of what is contemporary. So indigenous people have had to fight to be recognized as contemporaneous subjects that live, think, who are in the when we were celebrating the 500 years of the discovery of the Americas. I mean, it was all about, we're still here, we still exist. So I think that in the contemporary art world that is formal, institutionalized, there is a certain stereotype of what the indigenous world should take to those places. So maybe I am a bit critical because we see that there are worldviews that are shown, and I think that's very valuable, but there's also a political proposal there. And in that sense, I think that it has to do with the state logic, capitalism, neoliberalism. But of course, there is an issue regarding everything that we were talking about, because nowadays I could ask, who collects contemporary indigenous art? What are the foundations that are creating these instances? And there's something there that is still taking place. Sometimes indigenous artists have to show their indigenous natures in these spaces, but that doesn't happen with non-indigenous artists. I don't say to a Chilean artist, show me your Chileanness, right? But they do demand that from the indigenous artists, that they have to show this indigenous side. And I think that that's kind of how we conceive the practices in these institutionalized spaces. And due to this idea of contemporaneity, there's also an idea of what's universal. And I think that that's very relevant because it's also a way of discussing the current canon. There are a lot of things that I could say, but I will stop now because the idea is for everyone to have a chance to talk. So thank you so much for the space to talk.
Thank you so much, Christian. This is really enriching. I pretty much agree with many of the things you were mentioning about the kind of like, I think that in a way it's related to the still kind of present regime of identity politics, right? When it comes to art institutions and representation and so on, right? So that's really interesting. I want to point out to this question also from the audience, and I would like to hear, I mean, maybe Brenda could have also something to say, and yeah, Boaventura, I would be quite interested in know your view on this about mestizajes. So the question goes about like how, what about mestizo artists working through indigenous narratives? How problematic it might be, or it might be seen as a decolonizing practice strategy of sorts. So I'm saying that it's something quite important to think, especially in when thinking on Latin America, right? And if mestizajes as such, as ethnic racial configuration has been the hegemonic form of the national state, it's important in a way to name things, right? And to name how like colonial racialization has happened. But thinking of this, I was also trying to make the difference when speaking to some other curator friends and like that are working in the field of indigenous art. And for instance, in Canada, you have the term métis. So the métis are mestizos that are inscribing what has been called First Nations. So, but the mestizo in Latin America acquire quite a different dimension. So I would like to know, like, for instance, in your case, Brenda, I know you are engaged with this work, working with communities, but also seeing your work as a sort of, I would say, device of translation, of interpretation on itself. So if you could comment on that, and second, if Boaventura, you want to say something about mestizaje, would be great. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. Can you hear me properly? Yeah, for me, it's very problematic because I consider myself a mestiza. Otherwise, it would be cultural appropriation because I don't belong to any indigenous communities. Said that, I engage in the problems around or surrounding what is happening for the indigenous communities as well. You said a keyword that's very important in my work, that is interpretation. And I consider my work being an interpretation of what could have been the pre-Inca conception of time in my specific case. I use photography as a medium. And for me, it's double problematic because photography is a colonial practice. It was invented in England and in France at the same time, probably like those months, with Nicéphore Nipsey and Henry Fox Talbot. So, but also for me, it's very difficult because I engage with the preconception of indigenous time, and to interpret with photographic epistemology. So I use the camera thinking what could have been, what they saw, or how they interpreted time, specifically the pre-Inca cultures. so yeah, I'm not sure if I have the answer that Cleo is stating, but for me it's a thin line to work with, like to be a mestiza and consider myself a mestiza, but I consider also that I am doing a practice that could be a decolonization practice as well. I'm not sure if it's a strategy, but for me it's also a weapon, like the camera is a weapon to say something, to or re-say something or reinterpreted an issue that probably hasn't been answered before, although I don't want it to be answered, but I like to create in the middle of whatever could have been.
Thank you, Brenda.
Pablo, don't me to interject?
Yes, please.
¿Es posible que ahora hable en español y no en inglés?
I would say yes, yeah, much better.
Por
Sí.
a Fernando y a Cristian que
Claro,
están ahí, y a
perfecto.
Benuca y a Lena.
Nice to see everyone here. I had previously thought I would speak English or Spanish, so now I'm going to switch languages. Well, Lena, I think what you were saying is extremely interesting. I think we have in this continent for a long time, as you may know, Argentina used to say they had no minority groups, right? Not even the Mapuches were recognized. I remember that. Same thing in Chile. I mean, when they entered the United Nations, they declared that they didn't have any minorities, except for Bolivia, where it was actually impossible to say that, because that was the majority of the people, 62% approximately nowadays. So I think what we have now in Chile is that until 3 or 4 years ago, when I was in Temuco, it was difficult to make Mapuches be recognized there. So their struggle was tough to recognize. I mean, it wasn't recognized by people. So I would say that they have two different concepts of a nation. One, which is suppressed. I mean, the Argentinian nation and all the people who were in the geopolitical area of Argentina, Chileans, Brazilians, Portuguese people. But there was always another concept as well in terms of nationalities. So many in different countries. And what we're doing right now is we're trying to see how that can be compatible, how we can articulate all that in one country, two different notions of nationality. So that's why nowadays we've been discussing plurinational, so to say. So Chile as a plurinational state, which is going to recognize that Mapuches are a nation and that that nation has their own government or determination. I'm not saying it's going to be independent, but they're going to have self-management of their territories. So it is a constant struggle. There are some advances. There have been a few issues in Bolivia and Ecuador. In Brazil, for instance, now in Chile, some advances, some progresses, despite Piñera and everything they've been doing. So that would be the first thing. Also, I wanted to talk to Christian and Benuka about the following. This idea has been created that what is indigenous is in the past, but that's not true. We know that. So it is about changing that concept. We need to come up with a different meaning for that concept. So as an insurgent art, resistant art. And in that sense, in that regard, indigenous art, popular art, Afro art is very interesting in Cali. That monument, La Mano Resiste, the hand resists is a connection here of an aesthetics monument. So what I usually say is that it is important for artists to think about the abyssal line, which I mentioned before, and we have also the post-abyssal line. I mean, we need to denounce what is suppressed. We need to denounce whatever is wrong. They're denouncing the abyssal line, the division of humans and subhumans in this. So the thing here is we also need to see this from a political standpoint. Whenever a mestizo artist, whenever they get recognition for their art, let's say that a museum acquires a piece of their art, what happens is that artist goes beyond that abyssal line. I mean, they're not going to be invisible anymore. They're going to be visible in museums and all that. So as a person, they are going to overcome the abyssal line, but the community continues to be suppressed and excluded. So that's the drama here that we've been discussing. I mean, so many people, like the rappers, for instance, they are not recognized. Or sometimes they are recognized and they sell CDs, but their communities are not recognized. So what these artists need to make sure is that they are also attracting attention to that collective group of people who are invisibilized. I mean, they're being ignored. So whichever it is, whichever type of minority we're talking about, we have to make sure that that artist is going to also bring that collective group alongside with them. So I think that is very important. Also, we have to think about the meaning of aesthetics here, and this is very contemporary. I mean, when an individual artist is a symbol of the collective, they have a huge responsibility. And I believe that is yet a different type of aesthetics. It's not the conventional type, but it reduces individuals to their individuality and they're not able to articulate with their community. On the contrary, their value is measured by their separation from their community. Now, in terms of mestizo artists, it is something that we've discussed widely before in different spaces. And the thing is, let's say we're in the Caribbean, we're looking at Jamaica, we're looking at the Bahamas, we're looking at indigenous peoples and African American peoples in the Caribbean. We know that mestizo art is not an issue. I mean, the whole culture in the Caribbean is going to be mestizo. So we have Creole as well. That would be a core concept in the Caribbean art. And it's not just the Western culture here. We're also talking about Chinese culture and different types of cultures mixed. So that's something that they have as a core element. Now, the rest of the continents, we have two types of mixes, so to say. So we usually see that as a colonial thing because historically that has been the product of rapes of Black women by white men, basically, simply put. So it is a damage, a colonial damage, right, that was perpetrated. The thing here is that after 4 or 5 centuries, there have been many changes, many other types of mix. And that is why it is necessary to make sure that the oppressed, the suppressed, the excluded peoples to feel like they own that concept of mestizo. So that's something that we also worked on. You can go to my webpage actually and see there is a work that we did in the Andes, which is a conversation with Silvio Rivera. And we had a chat. We are friends. We've been discussing this for years, and we discussed two different types of mestizo, because there were always two types. I mean, the white mestizos and also the indigenous ones. So most of the mestizos were identified with Simon Bolivar, so the whites. And that is the colonial part of the mestizo, but there were others who related more to the indigenous ones, which would be the indigenous mestizos or the black mestizos. And they have always been fighters. They were decisive in the emancipation movement. There are many people who we have today in the continent who are mestizos, and they're identified as indigenous leaders. There is Ayrton, for instance, in Brazil, who is a mestizo leader in Brazil. So we see that happening. And that comes from that colonial harm that was perpetrated. So that's the way that it works. And this is why I believe that we should try and understand how to deal with these concepts a little bit better. And we shouldn't try to find a pristine indigenous art. That doesn't exist. We may talk about pre-Columbian art, sure, but nowadays, artists, you see, Bernardo, when you were talking about this contamination, I'm not sure it's negative. I mean, it is creativity. If you're able to see that as creativity, it's not a virus, it's a type of creativity. It's okay. The problem is there are some types of negative contamination when you lose your identity. So the white mestizos, maybe, so to speak. But anyway, it could be a way to rebuild a more broad identity. And that's the fight nowadays, because as you know, for a long time in Latin America, we didn't really talk about the indigenous people, or even the left-wing sociologists. They talked about peasants or farmers or country people. There is one person in Bolivia who did mention the specificities in that regard, a Marxist thinker, Jose Carlos Mariatric from Peru, who said that the original sin of Latin America was created without the native Indians, and it was against the native Indians. So this dates back from the 1920s, and it's remarkable to see that. And it has been of great inspiration for all of the other authors around. So I've worked with Aníbal Quijano, for instance, and Aníbal is a person whose work rebuilt Marxism with a completely different line of thought in Peru. So now, on what Brenda was saying, yeah, I think it is possible. Of course, it is very interesting to have this type of work that you're doing today. And there are many technological manners today to build that, to rebuild that through forensics, through photography, which is actually a very interesting thing. You may rebuild things that happened during war, for instance. It's almost kind of an invention, but anyway, it's very interesting to see that. And as Pablo was saying, it is a different visual structure. So the main issue here, and when I'm working with these indigenous artists, I think that the main issue with aesthetics, Western aesthetics and epistemology, is that we see this culture, but we only see what is visible, not what is invisible.
And for Amerindian cultures, ancestors are essential. I remember when I was in Colombia that they said that they couldn't decide because they had to talk to their ancestors. And the minister would ask, what do you mean the ancestors? The ancestors are all dead. And the indigenous people would say, no, they're alive. They're here with us. Of course, the minister could not see them. And when the minister decided to ask, so you have your ancestors here? Okay, well, ask them if they agree right now with this huge mining project, which was what they were discussing at that moment. And the chiefs and the shamans that were there said, no, we can only contact our ancestors when there's a full moon and after doing our rituals. We can't just talk to them out of the blue. All of us who have worked with indigenous people, we know that part of respect and dignity with ancestors comes from these rituals. So this limits the visual field. And what we can see is this limitation of the Western aesthetic epistemology. That's why sometimes it's very difficult to understand artists, because their art is a way of making visible what is invisible. And it's very hard to understand that, right? So that's why I think that we are undergoing a process, and I agree with Christian when he says that it's universal, that all the worldviews, yes, of course, more than universal, because they're actually universal. They're not human, they're from the cosmos. The issue is that if we have, I mean, there's not one universal thought. There is a subaltern cosmos, like we join a bunch of different aspects from the bottom of the different narratives of what is universal. There's not one universal truth. If there's not, you know, there can't just be one. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Boaventura.
Thank you so much, Boaventura.
A dejar con una última pregunta.
Okay, so we have one last question. And then I will give the floor to Sofia so that we can finish. This has been extremely interesting, and I think that we have a lot to discuss still. I think that we can maybe send the questions to the panelists so that they have them and maybe they can answer them. Well, I'm reading a few comments here. We have Joaquin Barrientos here that says that this last point that Boaventura said is key to the he mentions Haider Espel in Brazil, who makes us rethink the geoaesthetic function of the indigenous art category. And I'll even say Abel Rodriguez, that Lena also mentioned in her presentation. And then there's also a comment for Bernardo. It says that Tentativa is a beautiful, poetic, and symbolic gesture that takes a child's toy as a means of dismounting the colonizer from its equestrian mantle. So yes, I just wanted to tell you that that comment is up there. And just to finish, maybe someone wants to answer this question. They're asking here about the possible future and how these structures that we inherited of institutions that we're still forced to operate in, and she mentions academia and museums, what possible future can we have? I mean, for all of us who work with this, would anyone like to comment?
I think it will stay the same for a while, sadly. I'm a pessimist.
Disculpa, Pablo, tengo que decirte.
I'm so sorry, Pablo. When we think about the future, I mean, it makes me a little bit nervous Of course, there's a future. Neoliberalism has created this negative idea of us being a generation that, I mean, we're like the last resort. There's no alternative to capitalism or colonialism or to the patriarchy, you know? So, and that's really silly, actually. I mean, people who are in the front line are still resisting, and they are resisting. And there are some wins and a lot of losses. How did I make it to the epistemologies of the South? Well, I reached the conclusion that we had modern issues, but we didn't have modern solutions for equality, for example, because why do we understand differences as something that have to be homogenous and not something as actual differences? And when we look at the struggles, we say, of course, Blacks and whites in South Africa, when they worked on the constitution in 96 in South Africa, the Black people and the white people want to be equal, but they also want to be different because they're different. They eat differently. They have different cultures, but they want to be equal and not inferior. So, I mean, this dialogue is very important. What we need is an alternative thought or way of thinking. And that's been my proposal when I talk about the epistemologies of the South. But of course, we have to think that we are yet another generation. And I see all these young artists here. And I mean, they can really change things. And that's extremely important. We have to believe in this possibility. Sorry, I just wanted to add that. No, thank you so much for that comment and for all of the comments. I mean, I'm so thankful to all of you in this panel. I would love to stay here talking to all of you. And I hope that we can continue to be connected.
Thank you everyone so much for this amazing panel, this amazing conversation. I hope we will be able to continue the conversation. The questions that have not been answered will be answered. Thank you so much, Pablos. Thank you so much, Boaventura, Lena, Brenda, Bernardo, Venuca, and Christian. And I wish you all a really wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Join us next week for
Thank you so much.
Political Bodies.